The call from the FBI came on a Tuesday. Miss Miller, we found your evidence package. It's devastating to his case. I smiled for the first time in 2 years. Standing at the back of the courtroom, I watched Richard Blackwell's face drain of color as prosecutors displayed my meticulously documented trail of fraud. 3 years earlier, this financial advisor to the stars had systematically drained the trust fund my grandparents had left me. $2.4 million vanished while I trusted him blindly. The same man who'd vacationed on my yacht, who'd convinced me to introduce him to my wealthy friends, who'd laughed when I first questioned the strange transfers. That's just how high-level investing works, Sarah. Trust me. Now, as the lead federal prosecutor pointed directly at me, Blackwell finally recognized the woman he'd dismissed as just another privileged, financially illiterate heiress. I nodded slightly as his eyes widened in recognition. He'd never thought to look for me in Montana, where I'd rebuilt my life after losing everything. He certainly never imagined I'd spent 18 months documenting his entire operation before disappearing. I come from what coastal elites would call old Boston money, the kind of wealth that's worn in well-tailored but not flashy clothes, lives in homes passed through generations, and never, ever discusses actual dollar amounts. My grandfather built a shipping empire in the 1950s, while my grandmother managed their considerable real estate holdings. They were brilliant with money, but believed women should focus on family and philanthropy, not finance. My parents followed that template perfectly. Dad expanded the business internationally, while Mom chaired 3 charitable foundations. They raised me and my younger brother, James, in a sprawling Beacon Hill brownstone with summers in Nantucket. The Miller family name opened doors throughout New England. A lady never concerns herself with vulgar financial matters, my mother would say whenever I asked about our family's wealth. Instead, I was groomed to be the perfect society wife. Piano lessons, debutante balls, the right schools. When I chose to study art history at Wellesley instead of pursuing an MRS degree, my parents were disappointed but not surprised. I had always been the difficult one. James, meanwhile, was being groomed to take over the family empire. By 16, he was shadowing Dad at board meetings. By 21, he had his own office at Miller Maritime headquarters. The summer I turned 15 crystallized everything about our family dynamic. We were hosting the annual Miller Foundation Gala at our Nantucket estate. Hundreds of guests, a full orchestra, catering from Boston's finest restaurants. I'd spent weeks helping Mom plan every detail. That evening, wearing my first formal gown, I overheard Dad telling a business associate, "Sarah's a beautiful girl, but thank God we have James. The Miller name needs a practical mind, not an emotional one." Mom found me crying in the garden later. Instead of comfort, she offered correction. "Appearances matter more than feelings, Sarah. Fix your makeup and return to the party." When I graduated from college with honors, my parents gifted James a position as VP at Miller Maritime. I received a trust fund that would mature when I turned 30, with my father as trustee until then. "To protect you from yourself," he explained. When my parents died in a private plane crash when I was 28, I was devastated, but also secretly relieved. Finally free from their judgment, I moved to New York to pursue my passion for contemporary art. 2 years later, my trust fund matured and I gained control of my inheritance, $2.4 million plus a portfolio of investments. James took over the family business and immediately distanced himself from me. "You've never understood our legacy," he told me at our last real conversation. "Dad was right about you." I was determined to prove them wrong. I would manage my inheritance responsibly while building a life that mattered to me. That's when Richard Blackwell entered my life, recommended by one of my parents' oldest friends as the financial advisor who handles all the best families. Handsome, charming, with offices on Park Avenue and an impressive client list, Richard became not just my financial advisor, but my guide to a world I'd been raised to avoid understanding. "Your family wanted to protect you from the burden of wealth management," he said during our first meeting, "but I'm here to empower you. I believed him completely. After a lifetime of being told I couldn't handle money, his confidence in me was intoxicating. The trouble began so gradually I barely noticed. Richard had integrated himself into every aspect of my life. He wasn't just managing my trust, he'd become my closest confidant, my +1 at gallery openings, even my occasional weekend companion at my Hamptons cottage. When he suggested I consolidate all my accounts under his firm's management for better tax efficiency, it seemed logical. When he recommended transferring assets to specialized high-yield investment vehicles, I trusted his expertise. The quarterly statements he provided showed impressive growth. On paper, my $2.4 million had grown to nearly $3 million in just 18 months. I felt vindicated, finally proving my father wrong about my financial acumen, even if it was through Richard's guidance. "You have a natural instinct for this," Richard would say, showing me complex charts that I nodded at without fully understanding. "Most of my clients just want results. You actually want to learn." His praise was a balm to decades of familial dismissal. It was James who first raised concerns. We'd maintained a strained but civil relationship, exchanging birthday calls and occasional dinners when business brought him to New York. During one such dinner, I'd mentioned some of Richard's investment strategies. "A guaranteed 12% return? That's not possible in this market," James said, frowning. "Who is this guy?" I dismissed his concerns as jealousy. "Not everyone keeps their money in century-old shipping companies, James. There are innovative approaches now." "Just be careful," he warned. "If it sounds too good to be true." I left dinner angry, but James's words planted a seed of doubt. That night, I tried logging into my accounts directly instead of reviewing Richard's prepared statements. Several access codes didn't work. When I called the main numbers for the investment firms listed on my statements, 2 didn't exist. The next morning, I called Richard, trying to keep my voice casual. "I'm thinking about making a major donation to the Whitney Museum. Could you prepare a withdrawal of $100,000? "Of course," he said smoothly, "though the timing isn't ideal with our current positions. Give me 2 weeks to liquidate without penalty." I agreed, but that same day I contacted a forensic accountant recommended by a gallery owner friend. I'd sworn her to secrecy and paid her in cash. Richard called daily that week, unusually attentive. He invited me to dinner at Per Se, where he ordered $800 champagne and toasted our partnership. He suggested a trip to his villa in Emptied. "You need a break from the city. We could leave next week." "What about my Whitney donation?" I asked. "I'm working on it," he assured me. "These specialized funds have specific withdrawal windows." 3 days later, the forensic accountant called. "We need to meet immediately, not at your apartment." In a quiet corner of the New York Public Library, she laid out her findings. There were no specialized investment vehicles, no high-yield accounts. The statements were fabrications. Most of my money had been transferred through a labyrinth of shell companies, ultimately to accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. "Based on what I'm seeing," she said grimly, "this isn't just about you. It's a classic Ponzi scheme. He's probably doing this to dozens of clients." I felt physically ill, not just because of the money, but because I'd fallen for it so completely. I'd been so desperate to prove my financial competence that I'd walked straight into an obvious scam. That night, Richard called to confirm our Emptied trip. I feigned excitement while my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone. I needed time to figure out what to do. The next day, I visited James at his New York pied-à-terre. Our relationship had been fractured for years, but I had nowhere else to turn. "He's stolen almost everything," I admitted, handing over the accountant's report. "You were right." James didn't gloat or lecture. Instead, he called his company's legal team and security consultant. Within hours, we had a plan: document everything, gather evidence on other victims, and build a case for the FBI while pretending nothing was wrong. "He's planning to disappear soon," the security consultant explained. "Men like this always have an exit strategy. The trip to Emptied? That's probably one way for him." For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Richard's adoring client and travel companion, finalizing our European plans. By night, I worked with James's team, documenting every transaction, recording our conversations, and connecting with other clients in Richard's portfolio who had started asking uncomfortable questions. The pressure was crushing. Richard was becoming increasingly evasive about my Whitney donation and increasingly insistent about our departure date. I could see subtle changes in his behavior, a nervousness in his formerly confident demeanor, frequent checks of his phone, hushed calls that ended when I entered the room. Then came the day when everything accelerated. Richard called, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We need to move up our trip. Can you be ready tomorrow?" "What about my Whitney donation?" I pressed. "There's been a temporary liquidity issue," he said. "We'll handle it from Europe." That same afternoon, the security consultant confirmed what we'd feared. Richard had booked a solo connecting flight from Nice to Dubai, a non-extradition country. He was planning to abandon me in France and disappear with millions from dozens of victims. I had 24 hours to decide: confront him and potentially lose any chance of recovery, or play along and risk becoming complicit in his escape. As I packed a suitcase I never intended to take to the airport, I made my choice. I arranged to meet Richard for dinner at Daniel, supposedly our bon voyage celebration before our early morning flight. I chose it deliberately. It was where he'd first pitched his exclusive investment opportunities to me 2 years earlier, where he'd introduced me to other wealthy clients who would later become his victims. I arrived early and requested a central table. I needed witnesses. I needed to be seen. My brother's security team had positioned themselves discreetly throughout the restaurant. An FBI agent sat at the bar, waiting for my signal. Everything I carried, my phone, my watch, even my earrings, contained recording devices. Richard arrived looking immaculate as always, but his eyes darted around the room nervously. "I've arranged a car for 5 a.m., he said, kissing my cheek. "You packed light, correct? We can buy whatever you need in France." "Of course," I smiled, my heart hammering. Though I'm still concerned about my accounts, I was hoping we could go over the statements one more time. His smile tightened. "Sarah, we've been over this. The market fluctuates. Your investments are secure." I took a sip of water, steadying myself. "That's interesting, because I spoke with Meridian Partners yesterday. They have no record of any accounts in my name." A flash of panic crossed his face before his composure returned. "There must be some confusion. Those accounts are held in a specialized trust structure. Not all representatives have access to that information. And BlackRock Global? They've never heard of the exclusive fund you claim to place $800,000 in?" I kept my voice level, aware of nearby diners beginning to notice our tense conversation. Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This isn't the place to discuss confidential financial matters. We can sort this out tomorrow. In Antigua or in Dubai, where you have a connecting flight I'm not booked on." I watched the color drain from his face. "Or perhaps in the Caymans, where you've transferred most of my assets?" His hand shot out, gripping my wrist painfully. "Lower your voice," he hissed. I pulled my arm away and stood up. The restaurant had gone quiet. "I trusted you, Richard. I gave you access to my family's legacy, and you stole it." "You don't understand how these structures work," he said, loudly. "This is why your father kept you away from the family finances. You're hysterical over normal investment fluctuations." That was his mistake. Invoking my father, attempting to diminish me the same way my family had. Something broke loose inside me. Years of being underestimated, of being told I couldn't understand complex financial matters, of being patted on the head and dismissed. "Let me tell you what I understand," I said, my voice carrying through the hushed restaurant. "I understand shell companies. I understand wire transfers to offshore accounts. I understand that you've stolen approximately $47 million from at least 28 clients, including elderly couples who trusted you with their retirement funds. I reached into my purse and removed a flash drive, holding it up. I understand evidence. This contains 18 months of our communications, your fabricated statements, and the actual transactions you executed without authorization. It contains testimony from your office manager, your former assistant, and 4 other clients. The FBI agent had stood up now, moving toward our table. Richard's composure shattered. He knocked over his water glass, sputtering denials. "You're making a scene over nothing. This is a misunderstanding." Is Eleanor Winthrop's missing $3.2 million a misunderstanding? Is the Piermont family's vanished college fund for their disabled daughter a misunderstanding? My voice didn't waver. The FBI doesn't think so. Neither does the SEC. As if on cue, the agent approached, displaying his credentials. 2 more appeared at the restaurant entrance. Richard looked wildly around the room, then back at me with naked hatred. "You stupid bitch," he snarled. "You were the easiest mark I ever had. Daddy's little girl playing at understanding finance." I smiled then, calm in the eye of the storm I'd created. "That's where you're wrong, Richard. I'm not my father's daughter anymore. I'm my grandmother's granddaughter, the woman who quietly built a real estate empire while everyone underestimated her too." As the agents led him away, he shouted over his shoulder, "You'll never see a penny. It's all gone." I watched him disappear through the door, then sat down heavily in my chair, suddenly aware of dozens of eyes on me. James appeared from across the restaurant, putting a protective arm around my shoulders. "It's done," he said quietly. But it wasn't done. It was just beginning. The aftermath was chaos. News of Richard Blackwell's arrest exploded across financial media and Manhattan social circles. "Society Advisor's Ponzi scheme exposed," screamed the New York Post headline, complete with photos of Richard being escorted from Daniel and in handcuffs, and a smaller shot of me leaving with James. My phone rang constantly, with calls from other victims, journalists, and so-called friends wondering how much I'd lost. The FBI interviewed me for hours, combing through every interaction I'd had with Richard. The SEC had their own questions. Lawyers circled like sharks, offering to represent me in civil suits. Through it all, James remained steadfastly at my side, a shocking reversal of our previous relationship. "You were braver than I would have been," he admitted during a rare quiet moment in his office. "I would have just thrown money at lawyers and hidden from the publicity." But money was precisely the problem. While the FBI had frozen Richard's known assets, most of my inheritance had vanished into accounts they couldn't reach. The forensic accountants estimated I might recover 30 cents on the dollar, at best. My life in New York was financially unsustainable. "Move back to Boston," James suggested. "You can work for the foundation. Take the Beacon Hill house." The offer was generous, but felt like retreating to the very life I'd escaped. "I need to figure this out on my own terms," I told him. A week after Richard's arrest, Eleanor Winthrop invited me to tea. At 82, she was one of Boston's grande dames, and, I discovered, Richard's earliest victim. "I've been watching you," she said, pouring Darjeeling into delicate cups. "You have your grandmother's steel." She revealed something I'd never known. My grandmother had been her closest friend and business partner in several real estate ventures, separate from the Miller family enterprises. "Evelyn never trusted that son-in-law of hers to respect her business acumen," Eleanor explained, "so we created our own portfolio. When she died, she intended for those properties to pass directly to you on your 30th birthday." My hands shook as she slid a folder across the table. Richard intercepted the attorney's communications. He knew these properties existed and were coming to you, which is why he targeted you specifically. Inside the folder were deeds to 3 commercial buildings in Cambridge, a small apartment complex in Somerville, and development land outside Portland, Maine. Properties Richard had never discovered because they were held in a separate trust that hadn't yet matured when he entered my life. "Your grandmother believed women should control their own financial destiny. These aren't part of the Miller family holdings. They're yours alone." That night, I called the one person outside my family who'd tried to warn me about Richard, Mackenzie Howard, a gallery owner who'd introduced us but later grown suspicious. "I'm thinking of leaving New York," I told her. "I need a fresh start." "Come to Montana," she said without hesitation. "I'm opening a second gallery in Bozeman. It's becoming an arts hub, cost of living is reasonable, and no one will know your story." 2 weeks later, I locked my Manhattan apartment for the last time. I'd sold most of my belongings, keeping only what fit in my car. I told almost no one where I was going. The properties from my grandmother provided enough income to support a modest lifestyle while I rebuilt. James was the only family member who knew my destination. Montana was a revelation. I rented a small house on the outskirts of Bozeman, worked at Mackenzie's gallery, and slowly began healing. I learned actual financial management, not the smoke and mirrors version Richard had fed me. I studied real estate investment from legitimate mentors. I started a small foundation to support financial literacy for women. Meanwhile, the federal case against Richard built steadily. His lawyer reached out repeatedly, offering settlements if I'd withdraw my testimony. I refused each time. The FBI investigators marveled at the detailed evidence I'd gathered. "Most victims don't document this methodically," the lead agent told me. "You've given us a roadmap to his entire operation." 6 months into my Montana life, I received an unexpected call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'd found something puzzling while tracing Richard's assets, regular payments from an account associated with Miller Maritime, my family's company. Payments that had begun shortly after my parents' death. Confused, I called James. His long silence told me everything. "He was Dad's advisor first," James finally admitted. "After they died, I kept him on. He managed certain discrete accounts." "What discrete accounts?" My voice had gone cold. Another long pause. "Dad always maintained separate investments, tax considerations." "Tax evasion," I translated. "And you continued it. It's how business works, Sarah." The condescension in his voice was so familiar it ached. Richard helped move certain profits offshore. It was perfectly standard until he got greedy. The revelation was staggering. Richard hadn't randomly targeted me. He'd been embedded in my family's finances for years, enabled by my father and brother. His confidence scheme had been running far longer than anyone realized. I provided this new information to the FBI. 3 weeks later, Miller Maritime was under federal investigation. James faced potential criminal charges. The empire my grandfather had built, that my father had expanded, that had defined our family for generations, it was all at risk of collapse. "You've destroyed everything," James accused during a bitter phone call. "This company supports hundreds of employees, donates millions to charity." "You destroyed it when you chose to break the law," I replied, surprised by my own calm. Richard was just the inevitable consequence. 1 year after Richard's arrest, I returned to Boston for the first time. Not to the family estate, but to the federal courthouse, where Richard Blackwell was finally facing trial for his crimes against dozens of victims. I sat in the back, unnoticed among the crowd of journalists and spectators. The prosecutors had built a meticulous case, but something was missing. Evidence linking Richard directly to the Cyprus accounts, where most of the money had disappeared. Without it, he might face lesser charges, might serve minimal time. During a recess, I approached the lead prosecutor with a sealed envelope. "I disappeared for a reason," I told her. "I was following the money." Inside was the result of my year in Montana. Not just healing, but hunting. Working with ethical hackers, financial investigators, and other victims, I'd constructed a detailed map of Richard's entire operation, including accounts the FBI hadn't discovered. I documented his connection to organized crime figures who helped hide the stolen funds. Most crucially, I'd found evidence of his plan to flee and access the hidden millions after serving a minimal sentence. "Where did you get this?" the prosecutor asked, eyes wide. "I stopped being the victim and became the investigator," I replied. "I had nothing but time and motivation." When court resumed, the prosecution requested a delay to incorporate new evidence. Richard, confident in his legal team's strategy, looked annoyed but unconcerned until he spotted me walking toward the front of the courtroom. His face, when he recognized me, was everything I'd imagined during my year of self-imposed exile. The prosecutor called me as a surprise witness, and I watched Richard's arrogance crumble as I methodically outlined exactly where his money was hidden and how he'd planned to access it after serving what he expected to be a minimal sentence. 3 years after that day in court, Richard Blackwell is serving a 28-year federal sentence. The Miller Maritime Empire has been restructured under new leadership after James accepted a plea deal with significant penalties. And I've built something new, a financial literacy foundation for women that operates out of one of my grandmother's Cambridge buildings. I still live primarily in Montana, where I found peace and purpose, far from the world that both privileged and constrained me. The irony isn't lost on me. It took losing almost everything to finally gain true financial independence and understanding. My grandmother's hidden legacy wasn't just the properties she left me. It was the model of a woman who created security on her own terms in an era when that was nearly impossible. Like her, I've learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in self-determination. If you're watching this and feeling vulnerable about your own financial knowledge, remember, education is your best protection. No legitimate advisor will ever discourage your questions or make you feel small for asking them. Trust must be earned, not demanded. And sometimes the people who claim to protect you are the ones you need protection from. My name is Sarah Miller, and this is my story of loss, discovery, and reclamation. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more stories of financial resilience and recovery. Remember, understanding your own finances isn't just smart, it's essential.